Hello, everyone. Welcome to our last European Studies seminar in this semester. It's very good to have you back. And I'm very happy to welcome our special guest today, Dr. Edgar Sar, excuse me, who will present his seminal work on oppositional cooperation strategies in Hungary and Turkey. These are two countries that experienced democratic erosions in the last 2 decades. So Edgar's work is a very much welcome contribution to the literature, both theoretically and empirically. I'm very happy that we could organize this meeting. Edgar is a political scientist who is triangulating in between academia and the policy world. And he received his PhD in political science from the Bogazici University in Istanbul. And his research field includes de-democratization, opposition strategies, and authoritarian regimes, many other things, including secularism, state-society religion relations, and constitutional law. Edgar is also a research affiliate at the CEU Democracy Institute in Budapest, and a co-founder of and current co-director of the Istanbul Political Research Institute. And he's also a political commentator on Turkish television and writes columns in Turkish media and international affairs. Edgar, thank you so much for joining us today.
And thank you very much, Edith, for having me.
Thank you. We're also very lucky to have Bilge Yabanci with us, who has kindly accepted to serve as Edgar's discussant. And she is a research fellow at the Faculty of Human and Social Sciences at the University of Deusto in Bilbao, Spain. And her research field covers autocratization and the role of civil society, both as facilitators and actors of democratic resistance. So her research has been published in various academic journals. I don't think I'm going to list them all, but very highly reviewed and Q journals. Very happy to have you, Bilge, as well. Thank you for accepting our invitations. And before we start, just a few housekeeping rules. I'm going to give Edgar the floor for around 30-40 minutes to present his research. And then Bilge is going to take turn to comment on his work. And then we'll have a little bit of Q&A in between them. And then I open the floor for the discussion. So Edgar, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you, Edith. Let me share my presentation. Yeah. So I think you are now seeing the presentation, right? Okay. So thank you again, everyone, for coming. This is actually a paper that I will be soon submitting to a peer-reviewed journal, which I extracted from my PhD thesis, where I am investigating the opposition cooperation strategies, particularly pre-electoral cooperation in Hungary and Turkey. So let me begin with my question. In fact, as you all know, pre-electoral cooperation is a very unconventional electoral strategy, but it also proved very much effective in various trials by opposition parties under democratic erosion, part of which we have also seen in Turkey and Hungary, as you all well know. But this is an unconventional strategy, particularly when we consider it being done between parties that are separated from each other by deep-seated political cleavages. So it is a very common also strategy to be pursued by opposition parties in electoral authoritarian regimes. However, although both Turkey and Hungary are now considered as being electoral autocracies, what I am particularly focusing on is the process of democratic erosion as a particular form of autocratization, through which both countries like ended up in electoral authoritarianism, but still is quite different from other long-standing electoral authoritarian regimes. So democratic erosion is distinct in its gradual, protracted, and sneaky character, and that it is often characterized by regime uncertainty, because throughout this democratic erosion, especially opposition parties do not really perceive very well that they are actually going through a regime transformation. So this creates a big uncertainty for them, actually, what kind of transformation that regime is going under. So in that regard, it is also an uncertain process. So as I said, I am very much focusing on opposition parties that are separated from each other by deep-seated political cleavages, like ideological, identitarian cleavages. So the focus of the study is pre-electoral cooperation between such political parties, because for those political parties that are not separated by such cleavages, it is not as difficult, at least, to engage in such cooperation. So against this backdrop, the research question is how the opposition parties ultimately decide to engage in such cooperation despite the deep-seated political cleavages that separate them under democratic erosion. So we have some existing explanations that very much focus on long-standing electoral autocracies. As I said, such pre-electoral cooperation is not very much new under electoral authoritarianism. But as I said, the extant literature has mainly focused on long-standing electoral autocracies like Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia, etc. So what is new with this study is that it is actually focuses on electoral autocracies that experience a democratic erosion, which culminated in electoral authoritarianism. So the existing explanation, the prominent variable that has been so far suggested by existing explanation is the variable of incumbent vulnerability, which basically says that the more the incumbent regime is perceived vulnerable by the opposition parties, the more likely it gets for them to engage in such cooperation. So unless they perceive such vulnerability, it is very difficult for them to be ready to pay all the costs related with such cooperation and engage in such cooperation. So the existing explanations also have so far come up with additional variables like inter-party dependence or a distinct policy agenda. If the opposition parties have a distinct policy agenda, a policy agenda that is, significantly distinct from the incumbent ruling bloc, then it is more likely for them to engage in such cooperation. Or the more they perceive each other to be dependent on one another, the more likely it gets for them to engage in such cooperation. But as I said, these studies very much focus on long-standing electoral autocracies, which I argue in this study is not particularly practical in understanding such cooperation under democratic erosion, for at least three reasons. First, being the regime uncertainty that I mentioned, because when the opposition parties have very clear perceptions about what kind of regime that they have to operate under, then their calculus, all the interests calculations are different. Under democratic erosion, actually, it is particularly difficult for opposition parties to eventually understand that they are that they start operating under an authoritarian regime, that they are operating under an increasingly authoritarian regime, which in a way compels them to pursue some unconventional strategies. That is why the regime uncertainty under democratic erosion is an important difference from the conditions in long-standing electoral autocracies, the stable ones. And the second difference is political polarization. In stable electoral autocracies, we don't see such high levels of political polarization, whereas under democratic erosion, in the case of democratic erosion, political polarization is much more an often observed phenomenon. And also the variables affecting opposition cooperation vary by regime type, which means that the reasons that compel opposition parties to engage in pre-electoral opposition cooperation is different under democracies and under autocracies. However, under democratic erosion, we are observing a transition, a gradual transition from democracy, from a kind of democracy, which we see in Turkey and Hungary, to a kind of autocracy, which is, until recently at least, competitive kind of electoral autocracy in Turkey and Hungary. So, which suggests that the variables that might be interplay both in democracies and in autocracies might be in play under democratic erosion, which is also an important difference from long-standing stable autocracies. So my argument is that actually during the democratic erosion, a protracted process of political learning unfolds, which eventually persuades the opposition parties, which make them learn that pre-electoral cooperation is an essential strategy to be pursued against autocratizing, democracy eroding incumbents. So what characterizes, what constitutes this political learning is, in my argument, three variables. The first one is the extent to which electoral rules incentivize such cooperation, which in the literature is a variable that is often to be observed under democracies. The second one, to what extent anti-incumbent sentiment outweighs intra-opposition cleavages, the deep-seated political cleavages that I mentioned are separating the opposition parties. So to what extent this anti-incumbent sentiment is becoming, salient, that it is starting to outweigh the intra-opposition cleavages. And the third one being what kind of feedback is received from the most recent electoral experiences, whether it is affirmative, encouraging feedback or not. So this is a kind of diagram where, which is, in a way summarizing my theory. So let me go into a bit these three variables. The first variable is the electoral rules and whether they incentivize such pre-electoral cooperation. This is the first variable to trigger. I mean, unless there are some incentives associated with the electoral rules, it might be very much costly or difficult for the opposition parties to be ready to pay all the costs and challenges associated with electoral cooperation. So this is the first variable to trigger the opposition parties to engage in such cooperation. It is thus a necessary condition, but it is of course not sufficient, as we see in Hungary or Turkey or in other political contexts. So the second condition is what I call the reorientation of political cleavages. I didn't prefer deliberately to call it realignment because, as you can see in the figure, the red lines, the intra-opposition cleavages, actually continue to exist also under, a gradual and protracted process of democratic erosion. So they continue to separate the opposition parties from one another. But what I call the reorientation of these cleavages is actually a process whereby this anti-incumbent cleavage, which is separating the incumbents from the opposition parties, is getting so salient that it starts outweighing the intra-opposition cleavages. So this is the process of reorientation of political cleavages. And the affirmative feedback from the recent electoral experience. So this is very much obvious. It might be an electoral victory where the opposition parties have the perception that the cooperation actually worked. But it doesn't have to be the victory, even if the opposition parties are sometimes defeated by the incumbents. The results might be encouraging for opposition parties that make them think that the cooperation is in the right way. So even if we didn't get the victory this time, we might, just continue pursuing the strategy and reach the electoral victory. So it is a question of perception once again, where the question of operationalization is mainly based on qualitative data. So let me come to my findings. So actually, these are the empirical observations of cooperation outcomes in the elections in Turkey and Hungary. So when I say no cooperation, it's not that there was no cooperation at all between opposition parties, but there was no cooperation between the political parties that are separated from each other by deep-seated political fault lines. Like, for example, in 2014 general elections in Hungary, there was some kind of opposition cooperation, but not between the opposition parties that are separated from each other by such fault lines. Like, for example, at that time, as you might remember, Jobbik and the LMP rejected to engage in such cooperation between the left liberal Hungarian opposition, which were composed of at that time by three parties, and that those three parties cooperated with each other. But still, I coded that election no cooperation because they were not separated from each other by such big fault lines. So as you can see, there is a shift between the non-cooperative equilibrium to cooperative equilibrium in both countries, where in the local elections in 2024, which also happened in Hungary, by the way, but I didn't incorporate it into the analysis. But still, if I incorporated it, I would code it non-cooperative, although there were some cooperations between the opposition parties. But when we compare it, like, for example, between with 2019 local elections, the cooperative equilibrium was not that much deep in Hungary. So what I'm trying to explain is through this theory is basically this empirical observations. So these are the parties. I have two intra-opposition cleavages for each case for both Turkey and Hungary, left-right cleavages for both countries, and for Turkey we have Turkish-Kurdish, and for Hungary we have old and new opposition parties cleavages, which is a bit which requires some explanations maybe for those who have not read the paper, because to my understanding we didn't share the paper with the audience. Let me just speak a little bit about the old and new opposition parties. Actually, the old opposition parties are those that were in power, or that have some figures in them that were in power before Orban came back to power in 2010 general elections. And the new opposition parties are those who are basically rejecting to engage in any kind of cooperation between those old parties, because when I was doing my field research in Hungary, I realized that that fault line was actually a big fault line to overcome for the opposition parties, because of the kind of polarization that Orban was pushing in Hungary throughout the entire period in power. So the other fault lines are, the other cleavages are more or less clear, and we can come back to them if any question is raised during the QA. For the analysis, I have come up with a number of within case comparisons, 7 in total, 7 within case comparisons, which you can see here in this table, where I used some of the explanatory variables that I suggested. And this is the list that you can see. As you can see, the election type is, I try to create the within case comparisons with a single election type mostly, because it is generally, it makes things much more complicated to compare a general election with the local election, because there are completely different dynamics. However, in some instances, having some mixed kind of within case comparisons was also very much helpful, but generally it is only with a single election type that I created the within case comparisons. So let me just test my hypothesis with the within case comparisons that I came up with. The first hypothesis was the presence of incentives provided by electoral rules is a necessary condition, and it is indeed a necessary condition when we look at, for example, in the general elections in Turkey, where we can see the change in the cooperation outcome in 2018 general elections, which is, also related with other conditions. But of course, as I showed, the incentives provided by the electoral rules was a triggering, initially triggering factor. One might argue that, a lot changed in Turkey from 2011 all the way to 2018. So this difference in cooperation outcome might be related to some other things, which is true, of course. Therefore, I came up with another additional comparison where I compare 2 elections, one presidential, the other general, between which there were only a couple of months. So the regime conditions were, more or less the same. But still we have, whereas in the presidential election, we have the cooperative equilibrium, and in the general election, non-cooperative equilibrium, which is, I argue, mainly related with the difference in the electoral rules. But as I said, as I hypothesized, the presence of such incentives is not sufficient either, as we can see in the comparison of local elections in Turkey, like from 2014 and 2019, where in the 2014 local elections there was no cooperation, but in the 19 elections cooperation happened between the opposition parties, separated from each other by deep-seated political cleavages, although the incentives provided by the electoral rules were exactly the same, which bring us to the idea that there needs to be some other variables to explain this difference. which is exactly what we can also see in Hungary when we compare the general elections throughout the 2010s. You know, in 2014 and 2018 general elections, we didn't have a cooperation between ideologically diverse political opposition parties, whereas in 2022 we have. So this is also something to be explained by some variables other than the incentives provided by electoral rules, which in a way indicates that the presence of such incentives is not sufficient. So that brings us to the reorientation of political cleavages and the feedback. So the local election in Turkey, again, what explains the cooperative equilibrium back in 2019 local elections is actually the reorientation of political cleavages between the opposition parties that perceived to be, let's say, less salient than the anti-incumbent cleavage, given the deepening democratic erosion in that period. And also, when we look at the feedback that was received by the political parties, by the opposition parties, ahead of the 2019 local elections, the feedback that they received from the 2018 general elections, which they lost, by the way, but still which got them the opportunity to deprive the ruling AKP from its parliamentary majority and deprive the entire ruling bloc from its constitutional making qualified majority in the parliament. So this affirmative feedback also played an encouraging role to continue the strategy of pre-electoral cooperation ahead of the local elections. And when we compare the general election in 2023 in Turkey, which was a fiasco, like the one back in 2022 in Hungary, which was lost by the opposition parties, despite the unprecedentedly integrated cooperation strategy. So the negative feedback that they got from that election also is the prominent reason for them not to engage any kind of similar cooperation ahead of the 2024 local elections, which only was conducted a couple of months later, not a couple of months, but 9 months later. So I think this is the last slide. The comparison between the local elections in Hungary is very much similar to that in Turkey. Even the years are the same. The reason between the difference in the cooperation outcome is mainly related with what happened during the democratic erosion in this process, the reorientation of political cleavages. So the opposition parties came closer and closer to one another, mainly due to the anti-incumbent cleavage, the anti-incumbent sentiment that was getting more and more salient during the democratic erosion. But maybe even more importantly, the feedback that they got from the by-election in an Orban stronghold in Hódmezővásárhely back in 2018 was very much important. That an unprecedented opposition cooperation happened in that small election. Actually, opposition parties tried the unthinkable because they had basically nothing to lose. And surprisingly, they won the election against Orban's candidate in an Orban stronghold. So that positive feedback actually helped them a lot to overcome all the challenges and costs related with the opposition pre-electoral cooperation, which helped them pursue this strategy in 2019 local elections, which paid off quite a lot, won them many metropolitan municipalities around Hungary, including Budapest, districts of Budapest, and also other big cities around Hungary. And last but not least, I have a comparison between the presidential elections in Turkey, not general, but only the presidential elections, in each of which we see the cooperative outcome. So what I'm trying to show with this within case comparison is the importance of feedback, because this is a detail that you cannot see in this table, which you can only remark in the paper, of course. But the kinds and the particular cooperation strategies were different in each of these elections. Although the outcome is cooperation, the outcome is cooperative, but the ways of cooperation, the particular styles of cooperation was very much different. And these differences are very much related with the feedback that they got from the previous presidential election. Like, for example, in 2018, the opposition didn't come up with a single opposition joint candidate, which was a trauma for them from the 2014 presidential elections, because the joint candidate was too bad, and that created the perception in the opposition parties that we should not come up with joint candidates. Each of us should come up with an own candidate, and we should unite in the second round. But in that strategy also failed, which helped them to come back to the idea of joint opposition presidential candidate in 2023 presidential elections. So that also failed. So that created a kind of collapse of opposition cooperation altogether in 2024 local elections. Of course, Turkey will have its presidential elections. The scheduled date, of course, is 2028. We have a lot of time until then. But yeah, a lot is happening in both of these countries, actually, which is also very much related to opposition strategies. But this is the end of my presentation. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Edgar. This was very interesting. I already have a lot of questions, including under which conditions could this cooperation be effectively successful, because we see there's a lot of ups and downs in these two countries when it comes to that. But first, let's give the floor to Bilge. We're very much eager to hear what you think of Edgar's work. Bilge, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Edith. Thanks, Edgar. Thanks to CU for inviting me to read and discuss this paper. And I agree. I second Edith here. It's a very, very interesting paper. And I think it's also a very promising and well thought out paper on multiple layers of analysis. The complex thinking behind bring together all these layers, and I really liked your systematic approach of process tracing when you analyze the key elections in both countries, which brings a logical and methodical structure to the comparison, making the two-case comparative study quite thorough and complex. And I already have comments and questions for you that I cannot fit in 10 minutes. I think my instructions were to limit myself to 10 minutes. I will try to choose carefully those parts that might help you consider before submitting your work for publication. And I'm happy to share with you what I typed when reading your paper in a written format later on, Edgar. So to start with, in my opinion, you have given yourself a very challenging task, as there is no shortage of research on this topic. I mean, democratic backsliding or autocratization is one of the most studied topics nowadays of comparative political science research. Under this field, opposition cooperation, coordination, or pre-electoral alliances are the most studied sub-area lately, particularly. And I think there is already considerable amount of research on why and how and when opposition parties decide to join forces, nominate a single candidate or a joint list. So my first point is that, and my invitation for you to, particularly for the introduction at the very beginning, to sharpen your core argument beyond the statement that the general statement that there is a gradual process of learning and adaptation. Because maybe as a standalone claim, given that the number of studies that came recently about electoral cooperation, coordination between opposition parties might not be as original as you think. One of the main key takeaways, actually, of this already existing literature is that under the duress of democratic backsliding, opposition parties first learn that they need to cooperate, and second, since they do not know how to do so from the beginning, they learn how to cooperate gradually and adapt to the very volatile and changing conditions of democratic backsliding. But in my opinion, your paper promises more than that, given that all this multi-layered analysis they do. But you might need to highlight some dimensions that remain under the shadow of maybe not so original claim that opposition learns to cooperate and learns to adapt. In the very beginning, actually, you hint at something, in my opinion, more worthy of bringing to the surface. That you mentioned cooperation between opposition parties depends on, first, distinct political trajectories, and second, the opposition traditions in these countries or in any country that is undergoing democratic backsliding. However, you do not elaborate on what these distinct political trajectories and opposition traditions entail as a very beginning, the beginning. And I believe that through your process tracing approach, you have more to convey to the reader. And the true distinctiveness of this paper likely resides not merely stating that learning occurs, but rather laying out and bringing forward the specific mechanisms through which this learning and adaptation unfold, and how these processes are uniquely shaped by distinct political trajectories and opposition traditions in Turkey and Hungary. And to elevate the paper's theoretical contribution, I think it's important to move beyond just stating. I think you're hiding your main contribution in there. So maybe you need to rewrite the introductory part to highlight this contribution. And this requires unpacking what are these distinct political trajectories and distinct opposition traditions that you hint early on, and a dedicated section defining and operationalizing these concepts for both Turkey and Hungary would provide a stronger foundation for the comparative analysis. This explains why learning and adaptation manifest differently across cases, thereby offering more nuanced regional contribution to that existing general theories might not be capturing. My second point is about the need for theorizing, what I would say here, endogeneity or linkages, interlinkages among your threefold conceptual analytical framework. And you have this threefold analytical base, right, that I really like. The electoral rules, whether and to what extent they encourage or allow opposition cooperation, because certain rules of electoral competition would naturally incentivize cooperation. Second, you mentioned whether anti-incumbent sentiment outweighs intra-opposition disagreements. Therefore, they will remove the incumbents. The will to remove incumbents should be high enough so that opposition parties can overlook their own differences and focus on the common goal. And the third is what you call the feedback from the previous elections. Now, there is a bit of imbalance in the paper because in its current form, the paper heavily relies on the third dimension, that is feedback from previous elections. To highlight that learning and adaptation occurs. And you heavily emphasize this third dimension. And the first two factors was kind of at least discussed in a relatively stated or less influential on the nature of learning and adaptation. And more comprehensive analysis should explicitly discuss how these electoral rules and changing political cleavages also continuously influence opposition learning adaptation. For example, changes in the electoral thresholds from one election to another, or strategic manipulation of rules over time by the incumbent, gerrymandering, etc., can directly force new forms of learning and adaptation, but these are not clearly discussed. Also, paper currently treats these three factors as distinct and separate influences on the pre-electoral coalition making. I understand you proceed with a Boolean logic. The electoral rules, check, yes, no, move on. Changing cleavages, yes, no, move on. However, maybe there is room for investigating the level of endogeneity or intermediation among them. For instance, instead of theorizing that electoral rules directly influence the changes of pre-electoral coalition between opposition parties directly, those electoral rules may also indirectly inform learning adaptation through the, for example, the third leg of your analytical framework, that is election results. So in this figure one, you visualize these three factors as preconditions for one another, if I understand correctly, for the process tracing methodology. And then the analysis becomes a bit, artificially separated. Because process tracing emphasizes this complex causal relationships and between all these factors. And it would be beneficial to explicitly trace how changes in electoral rules might interact with shifts in anti-incumbent sentiments or produce specific lessons learned then directly shaping the subsequent coalition strategies. And maybe considering adding, in your figure, some arrows or more complex diagram to illustrate the hypothesized interlinkages also between three factors. Feedback loops among these three factors would significantly advance the explanatory analytical model. And this would provide maybe a more sophisticated understanding of the causal pathways at play. And my third point would be to invite you maybe clarify the empirical presentation, because you have so many tables, but some of these tables could benefit from an enhanced kind of clarity in presentation, because you have all these three factors for each elections, and then in some tables or in some parts you cite some factors are as necessary or sufficient. And in some of the tables that not all factors are discussed or mentioned. So maybe a more comprehensive and holistic table I would recommend. And this table maybe can be for each country and each election analyzed and provide a brief and consistent summary of all three analytical factors: electoral rules, anti-incumbent sentiment, cleavages, and lessons learned or electoral outcomes. So maybe it would be much neater visualization for the reader. Can easily compare cases and identify patterns with one look. I mean, right now I was going back and forth between your tables, and I was trying to capture which one was Hungary, which one. It is a bit difficult for the reader to trace these patterns. You are involved a lot in the paper, and you know by heart. But for reviewers or for readers, maybe it's difficult. Especially for the easy verification, easy process tracing. It's interesting you mentioned this necessary and sufficient conditions, but in the process tracing, there are these usual empirical tests, like the hoop tests for necessary conditions or sufficient conditions, the smoking gun tests. Maybe they should be explicitly defined and applied for each election and each factor. The paper should clearly state whether what is being argued is a necessary condition or sufficient condition or a combination of it. So the fourth point that I was thinking that the terminology that you use to describe the impact of post-electoral outcomes, and maybe this can be refined and replaced. And looking at your tables and your discussion, the third factor maybe should be relabeled as electoral success of opposition coalition rather than the general feedback from previous elections. And actually, it appears that it is a necessary factor influencing future opposition coalitions. Maybe you can replace it as success in previous electoral coalition. Success you can define it either in terms of winning elections or simply increasing the total vote share of the coalition. And this would provide a greater precision, because the success or failure of the prior electoral outcomes of winning elections or increasing vote share is more precise than the general feedback using of feedback. And this implies a more direct link between past performance and future strategic choices. Because it seems like if coalition fails to achieve its objectives, and it didn't increase its vote share or didn't win, opposition parties would abandon specific cooperation strategy in subsequent elections. The fifth major point that I wanted to bring up is basically in figure 2, I like that, the presentation of it where your hexagon turns into more like this hourglass shape. It's really nice. About the deepening the political cleavages and changing the political cleavages. But in the paper, the explanation of how and why these reorientations occur could be deepened, especially considering that political cleavages are often persistent structural issues in countries. The current explanation in the paper suggests that reorientation occurs almost automatically as autocratization deepens. You don't explain why and how much. The reorientation and suspension of political cleavages in favor of anti-incumbent and pro-incumbent cleavage actually is not a natural process. It should be a dynamic outcome of both elite level strategic actions and crucial water level responses. For example, incumbents actively exploit or deepen polarization along certain lines, which is likely to compel the opposition to reevaluate traditional cleavages. And also, in my opinion, the paper needs to explicitly integrate the crucial role of voters in this reorientation, because voters facing an existential threat to democracy might signal to opposition parties that all cleavages are less important now, and it should be the voters themselves who signal to the opposition parties that certain old cleavages are no longer, as important as they think. So actually, it's one of the papers or the book, I don't remember, that you were mentioning by Ong, who argues that opposition parties often ask significant sacrifices from their voters when they establish coalitions by requesting them to vote for candidates or join lists that are ideologically distant from their own worldviews. And this implies a form of voter sacrifice, a form of voter choice. And where is in your picture, where is the voters is not clear. There are other points I wanted to bring up, like maybe you should be integrating the region vulnerability into the analytical framework more directly, because you mention it a lot. And maybe there are a couple of papers that you can benefit by Kurt Wayland about learning and adaptation, because he criticizes in the recent paper overemphasizing the agency at the expense of structural factors. And also there is another paper, I will send you the details, by Orhan Samet, work on nearly stunning elections. And he highlights that when opposition parties come very close to victory, but ultimately fall short of turnover, autocratization is expected to deepen drastically due to incumbents sensing a significant threat and implementing massive scale repression, what's happening right now in Turkey, in my opinion. Final point that I wonder if you consider, or maybe you can mention it and in your conclusion, that learning is not only happening within the country, but maybe the potential for transnational dimension of learning warrants consideration, not for your paper, but maybe as a kind of shortcoming for avenue for future research, that opposition parties also learn about experiences and successes and failures of opposition parties in other countries, acknowledging the possibility of transnational learning as a promising avenue for future research. I think I spoke already more than what I was allowed to. Sorry if I took longer. But it's a great paper, a lot of potential, and I think it's almost ready for submission and getting the feedback from reviewers. Thanks again for letting me to comment on it.
Thank you, Bilge. This was very constructive and super thorough. And I'm pretty sure that I've seen Edgar's face while he's been listening to you. I think he was making lots of notes. So I think it's going to help shaping up this otherwise already very good work to get published in a great journal. Please have a little conversation in between you. I'm sure Edgar would love to get back to you on some points. And Bilge, if you have something that you wanted to say, but you thought it's not going to fit in 10 minutes, please add on, because we still have some time. And then I'm going to open the floor for the audience.
Thank you, Edith. You are very much right. You read my face in a correct way, I think. Thank you very much, Bilge. Each of your comment is well noted, and I think it will be very much helpful for me to revise the paper. I'm not sure if I get such thorough feedback from the reviewers even. So thank you very much. Each of the points is well noted. Let me just talk a little bit about what you pointed out. This is a criticism that I have got also from some other readers, that I should sharpen my argument in the introduction part, highlight what is really important, what kind of contribution this paper is making to the literature. So I will definitely take this into consideration. Actually, it's also a very good idea to incorporate somehow the electoral manipulations done by the incumbents, probably to the part where I talk about electoral rules, because I admit in my writing, they might seem a little bit like automatically happening, like as if there was no intervention by the incumbents at all, which is not true, of course, because the rules are constantly manipulated by the incumbents. And in Turkey, we can particularly see this. Maybe in Hungary, less so, because even if there were some changes, some very slight changes, like, for example, that ahead of the 2022 general elections, which in a way compelled the opposition parties to come up with a joint list. Because, if the opposition parties can get the payoffs of the cooperation through a much more flexible ways of cooperation, like, for example, in Poland, where there is a parliamentary elections and they just didn't have to come up with a joint list or even a joint campaign. They just needed to have a pledge that they would, engage in a post-election coalition if should they have a majority in the parliament, which was the case. So the more flexible the cooperation can be for the opposition, the less serious the costs related with the cooperation are. So it is also a very effective strategy for the incumbents to tighten the rules, to make cooperation less flexible, to compel the opposition parties, or to make them feel compelled to cooperate in a very integrated way, which is also then bringing the problem of the intra-opposition cleavages. It was completely unthinkable for, like, for example, momentum or democratic coalition or even the Hungarian Socialist Party to engage in cooperation with Jobbik. So, I mean, if they had a possibility to pursue this cooperation in a much more technical or flexible way without having to engage in a joint campaign, for instance. I mean, it would have been much easier for them, of course, or it would have been even much more difficult for the Mihazang party at the end that emerged with the claim that Jobbik is not anymore representing the people's interests, having pursued the cooperation with the left liberal parties. Now it's our turn. And this is exactly what happened, not exactly, but very much similarly, what happened in Turkey with the third presidential candidate ahead of the 2023 general elections, Sinan Oğan's bloc, or Ümit Özdağ's bloc, the nationalist bloc, which always accused, the nationalist parties of the opposition cooperation of having cooperated with the pro-Kurdish parties and even the CHP. So this created the problem. So had they had the possibility of cooperating in a much more flexible way, it would have been much easier for them, even at the voter level, to have the payoffs of the cooperation. And I liked very much the idea of having a much more complex diagram when we see the interaction between the three variables, of course. Although I have always in my mind the idea of not overcomplicating the process, but still it's a very good idea. Thank you very much, Bilge, once again. The problem with a single table, actually, that was what I had in mind initially. But the problem is that the feedback reception process is much more complicated, even in the minds of the opposition parties, which, by the way, I also admit I failed to comprehensively show in the paper because it would have been much longer. Maybe I should drop some other things to keep the length of the paper, but to incorporate some more details that are actually needed to indicate my point. So maybe I should get back to the idea of a single table, but the feedback reception is so complex that sometimes they get the feedback from the most recent election. Sometimes, if it is a local election, then the most recent local election. So it would be, I thought, much more difficult to show all this feedback reception process through a single table. That's why I dropped the idea of having a single table. But I mean, maybe I should rethink that idea. Some very briefly, learning also happens at the transnational level, something I can at least incorporate in my conclusion, as you well proposed, and how and why this reorientation happens. I admit at the empirical level, particularly, I should indicate much more in a comprehensive way how this reorientation happens. I mean, in the paper, some readers got the impression that as you also did, that it is as if it is something that automatically or naturally happens. But it does not, of course. So I should indicate at the empirical level how this reorientation happens, what kind of differences the approaches between the approaches of the political parties to one another actually changes during the process and under democratic erosion. Yeah. So let me stop here. But as I said, Bilge, thank you very much. Each of your point is very much helpful, and I think it will also very much help me revise my paper before I submit. Thank you.
Thank you,
Okay.
Edgar.
Unless Bilge would like to get back with some comments to Edgar, maybe at a later point there will be some back and forth so that you will Bilge have some more space to comment and add to this. I see that Professor Nizhnik has raised his hand, so let's give him the floor first, and then let's see how many other questions we have, including mine. Professor Nizhnik.
Okay, so thank you. It was very interesting. This presentation, especially in our situation where in Poland we had a very recent experience of electoral process and also experience of cooperation between former opposition parties. I have basically two questions. But first, maybe just one comment on this transnational examples that indeed have some impact on situation in this area. We had in Poland very good examples when leader of the Law and Justice party, Kaczyński, before he got to power, he announced that he intends to establish Budapest in Warsaw, which means he was simply following certain examples from Hungary, of Orban's Hungary. So, of course, so these transnational examples are indeed somehow important. But first question is I mean, consider just your methodological problem. Among those three factors that are important, you are talking about this reorientation of political cleavages. Usually, this reorientation is non-explicit. So, how did you study it in your research? And above, and then again, it's very difficult not to look into our own experience in Poland. Except those three factors, I noticed one which is very important during both before election and after election. And this is political aspiration of some political leaders of opposition parties. So these political aspirations in some cases block the possibility of cooperation. We have one case like this in Poland, and in basically all cases of parties that form a coalition, we still see these political aspirations of individuals that are leading those parties as certain problems in further work and cooperation after they form the government. So the question is whether you ever consider including. Of course, it's very difficult to study it. I don't know how to include in a study that basically take into consideration something that is clearly empirical, like this orientation of political differences or incentive of electoral rules or feedback from the former electoral experience. So, but here it's very difficult. It's a different kind of factor, but I believe it's quite important. So this is what we are. Yes.
Thank you, Professor Nizhnik. Edgar, let's respond to that, and then I'll see if I can collect more questions, or I'm just gonna come in with mine.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Nizhnik. Yeah, as you also rightfully said, transnational learning also happens, especially within the EU or within the um, um, um, even more closer context of Visegrad countries in Central and Eastern Europe. With regard to your question about methodology, yes, you are right. The what I call the reorientation of political cleavages generally happens inexplicitly. So how I studied it is basically through discourse analysis, because I made a very thorough media scanning, process tracing, looking at the discourses of opposition leaders ahead of the elections and during their campaigns, even before their campaigns. I looked at their speeches and the news, beginning from 4 months in advance before each election, and try to understand if there is a change in their discourse, if there is a change between the nature of the political cleavages, or between how prioritized these cleavages are, because the cleavages continue to exist, as I said. I mean, the anti-incumbent cleavage and the anti-incumbent sentiment begins to exist actually the moment a party is coming to power. But the process whereby this anti-incumbent sentiment becomes an actual cleavage between the incumbent bloc, the ruling bloc, and all the opposition parties, and the process through which this cleavage becomes salient, increasingly salient, and so salient that it starts overweighing the intra-opposition cleavages, is actually to be observed also in the discourses between the opposition party, discourse of the opposition party leaders, the approaches they have to one another. And I agree that in the paper I should indicate them much more explicitly, the change in this discourse. So this is a very rightful question to begin with. And the second question with regard to an possibly additional parameter that determines opposition cooperation, political aspirations of opposition leaders or leaders of some opposition parties. Well, it would be complicated to incorporate it to my existing framework, of course. But when I mean, I have also thought of this a lot throughout my study, also during the PhD thesis writing process, because political leaders have aspirations, and this is a kind of difficulty, a challenge that the opposition cooperation actually has also naturally. I think of, for example, Gyurcsány in Hungary, a leader that has a big baggage from the past, and also big, let's say, quote unquote, fan club among the voters. So, and also a leader that has a lot of aspirations. So it is neither possible to fully include him in opposition cooperation, nor is it possible to fully exclude him. So that was a dilemma that opposition parties had. But with the entire process of democratic erosion and the feedback, the affirmative feedback that they received from the success stories of the past, it becomes much more difficult for the opposition parties not to engage in cooperation because they are afraid from the reaction of the voters. So even ambitious leaders that have, quite big political aspirations, cannot really resist that. But under such circumstances, the political aspirations play sometimes even a disruptive role after the building of the cooperation, which happened also in Hungary, but also in Turkey. I mean, Kılıçdaroğlu's, for example, candidacy that was not wanted by some other leaders or parties within the opposition created a big problem. But at the end of the day, cooperation continued, cooperation resisted all these aspirations, but I think that had a very big effect on the success of the cooperation or on the effectiveness of the cooperation. But what I'm focusing on in my paper is basically whether cooperation happens or not, or under what conditions this cooperation happens. Also trying to answer the question of Edith that she initially asked, I deliberately did not have the success of the cooperation in terms of electoral victory as independent variable, as the variable that I'm trying to explain, a dependent variable, deliberately, because when we look at the electoral victories as dependent variables, as the variables that we wish to explain, then there should be lots of other variables that come into play, not only the cooperation. If the effectiveness of the cooperation were the only parameter to explain the success of the cooperation in terms of electoral victory, then I mean it would have been much more feasible to engage in some attempts to, you know, come up with some frameworks, theoretical frameworks, how through which to explain the electoral success of the opposition. But in the course of the entire research, I realized that, I mean, it would be almost impossible. So I dropped the idea of having electoral success or the success of opposition cooperation as a dependent variable. So therefore, I focused exclusively on how cooperation happens, under which conditions it happens, because creating the cooperative equilibrium for the opposition parties is also very much difficult and a challenging task. So I have always thought that trying to explain this is also, something worth doing. So I did this, but still, the electoral outcomes, when it also comes into play, I think it would be much more difficult to do this. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you for all three of you. And at the moment, I don't see any raised hands. So while people might still think about a question, I would come in with mine. So Edgar, I wanted to cycle back to this transnational learning, because while you were giving the presentation, I was already thinking about it. Like, you have this very convincing threefold analytical framework, which I like a lot. But I couldn't help but wondering about other external factors that might be also played here. So maybe that's something you could allude to in the conclusion. And I was specifically thinking about Hungarian oppositional parties' embeddedness in EU-level parties. So these parties are not existing in a vacuum. They're part of, Liberals, Greens, SND in the European Parliament as well. This is a heavy embeddedness, which is less of a factor in case of Turkey, I know. So this is methodologically a little bit problematic, but still. So I guess my question is, what do you think how this kind of EU embeddedness in the EU party structure could inform their strategic priorities or not? And my second question is a little bit looking into the future, which I know it's not our favorite as social scientists, but I was thinking, how would your key findings in this paper explain, or just what do you think about recent developments in Hungary right now, where we have a new oppositional model on the rise. There is a new party that does not want to cooperate with anyone, and this single party looks like super probably it's going to be the sole challenger of Viktor Orban's party next year at the parliamentary elections. So I'm just wondering, how does that political outcome relate to your theoretical expectations and your work in general? Thank you.
Shall I answer this or?
Please do.
Okay, thank
yeah,
you.
thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Edith. As I said, I think transnational learning or transnational factors might be much more influential within the EU than, you know, a kind of transactional dynamic that goes beyond the EU. For example, when I remember, because I was in Budapest observing the elections back in 2022, general elections, and Turkey was watching those elections much more, maybe unprecedentedly close, because of what happened there. And there was some kind of learning, transnational learning because I remember, for example, Mayor Koraçoy'un, before he was elected mayor back in 2019, visited Mayor İmamoğlu in Istanbul. But it was, of course, a visit that was a diplomatic visit. But of course, like they in their joint press conference, they were mentioning about some exchanges, about their tactics and strategies. I don't know to what extent systematic those exchanges are. And Turkey was watching very unprecedentedly closely the elections in Hungary. And when the opposition fiasco happened in Hungary, the reaction from the Turkish opposition parties, well, the dynamics and the conditions are very much different there. It's non-comparable at all, etc. But still, when we look at the reasons of the defeat, well, we might very well come up with some similar reasons. But between countries like Poland and Hungary, I think transnational learning has a bigger chance. But still, I'm a bit skeptical because the domestic context and the conditions are so different in some ways. Of course, I'm not a Poland expert, by the way, but I mean, you know much better than me. The differences that I argue are shaping the cooperation dynamics in these countries are so different that have a very big effect on both the cooperation outcome, whether cooperation happens or not, and the election outcome, whether cooperation actually works in terms of the election victory. So as I said, in Hungary, in Poland, the parliamentary regime, gave the possibility of, a post-election coalition, which happened at the pre-electoral level only, a kind of pledge, which was very much obvious. I mean, all the people knew in advance that all the opposition parties were against the peace, and that they were much more far away from the peace than they were far away from one another. So that was very much obvious, and it gave them the opportunity to engage in a very flexible cooperation. So the post-election coalition, might have some other problems, of course. I mean, this is completely another subject. The EU Parliament elections, for example, in Hungary, because Orban came back to power in a very experienced way, I mean, he had been like Trump, for example. Trump came back to power in a much more experienced way. Like, I mean, in his first term, he was much more amateurish in terms of, you know, at many levels. But when Orban came back to power, I mean, his constitutional amendment package was almost ready, and he did it right away. And Orban has been enjoying something that Erdogan has never enjoyed throughout his power, which is the chance of amending the constitution anytime, anytime. I mean, when we look at their support levels in the society, Orban and Erdogan have so far enjoyed similar levels of popular support, but which all, I mean, did not give Erdogan anything near to the parliamentary majority that Orban had, just because of the electoral rules that he amended right after he came back to power in 2010, with the constitutional amendment as well. So the effect of this electoral rules is very much to be seen in the European Union European Parliament elections, which is the only electoral instance for the Hungarian oppositions where they don't have to, you know, engage in any kind of cooperation, because there is this proportional representation. Yeah. Whereas in Poland, you have in the Polish electoral system is much more proportional than any Hungarian election in domestic politics. So therefore, I think this transnational learning has also some limits in terms of its effect on the actual cooperation outcome. But other than that, I think at the political level, of course, this transnational learning happens. I think when we consider what an unconventional electoral strategy pre-electoral cooperation is, particularly between those ideologically diverse political parties, I think the transnational learning, you know, shows its effect. I mean, because parties learn from each other that they have to engage in such cooperation. But it is, in my opinion, still not more influential than what they learn from their past experience domestically. Yeah. So therefore, transnational learning is not in my framework, because I argue that opposition parties still much more learn to cooperate from their past experiences, their own experiences, rather than the experiences of some other opposition parties somewhere else. But still, as I said, I admit the effect. And the new opposition model, I think this is very much important. And I argue that the emergence of this what you call new opposition model in Hungary, because it also emerged in Turkey, this is also something where both countries are similar to one another, has also a lot to do with their experiences of cooperation during all these years. Because maybe it's not the cooperation that we should blame, or they blame, but the cooperation between the establishment and conventional parties. Yeah, I mean, because there has always been the idea of having a strong leader against a strong incumbent leader. We should come up with not very technical, very bureaucratic cooperation of 6 opposition parties that does not have a single leader, because, you know, having a single leader of a cooperation of opposition parties, you know, composed of 6 parties is difficult, because all opposition party leaders have some kind of ambitions and aspirations. So I think this is a result of also all the experiences throughout all the experiences of cooperation under democratic erosion. And also, I mean, this new leader, Peter Magyar, is, you know, in terms of his charisma, he is also, I think, much stronger than any opposition leader that have so far showed up in Hungarian politics. And I think, once again, let me underline the importance of feedback here, because we should not forget that after the 2018 by-elections in Hódmezővásárhely, the parties that were reluctant to cooperate with the rest of the opposition, like LMP and Jobbik, were punished by the electorate in the European Parliament elections. So at that time, the reluctance of cooperating with the rest of the opposition is something that the voters, that opposition voters, did not particularly like, because they were considering such reluctance as a source of a possible defeat, because the voters also were thinking that it is only through cooperation that we could defeat Orban and his ruling bloc. But now, after all these defeats, and especially the defeat back in 2022, the voters also came to the idea that, okay, it is not about cooperation. There is something that we lack, something else that we are lacking, which might be the charismatic leader, and which is now the case in Hungary, and which is once again underlying the important point that Bilge made, that voters play a role in both reorientation of political cleavages and the feedback reception. And one more point, if you allow me, because in Turkey also we have a new opposition model, actually, but because it is a new opposition model that is basically composed of one opposition party, in that regard, it is similar to Hungary. But what is very much difficult from Hungary is that this party is the party that previously built the big opposition umbrella coalitions previously, whereas in Hungary, we are talking about a completely new opposition party. So in Hungary, whereas in Hungary we are seeing the collapse of the rest of the opposition and the rise of a single new opposition party, in Turkey we are talking about the rise of the main opposition party that has always been an opposition, that is an establishment party, and the rise of this opposition party as the single challenger for Mr. Erdogan is because the other opposition parties rejected to cooperate with them in the previous local elections. So it is the rest of the opposition parties that rejected the cooperation, unlike the rising party rejecting the cooperation between the rest of the opposition parties. So these are some striking differences between Turkey and Hungary, but I think there will be a lot to research on this new opposition model, both in Hungary and Turkey. But let me stop here. I spoke a lot, sorry. But these were very good questions, that's why.
No, like indeed, it sounds like that you might have still a lot of work with contrasting these two cases because of the changing model and the recent developments. Let me just add one more thing before we close it up. I actually just wanted to back up on this idea that you mentioned, that there probably was some sort of a transnational learning in between Hungarian and the Turkish opposition when it comes to the mayors of Istanbul and Budapest. Our paper with one of my colleagues is going to be published very soon, where we have been investigating local democratic innovations and how do they mitigate national level populism. And indeed, we made interviews with the mayor of Budapest, who was confirming that they have been not copy pasting, but get inspired by the radical love strategy of your mayor in Istanbul. So there has been a lot of back and forth, at least for the Hungarian opposition for sure. Turkish opposition was a source of inspiration at many levels. Whether if that effectively impacted the cooperation in between the parties? That's another question that needs to be investigated. We didn't do that. Just wanted to confirm that this was actually happening. Probably worth looking into that. Thank you so much, Edgar. Thank you so much, Bilge, for the presentation, for the discussion, for the great questions and the constructive ideas. We were very happy to have you here. I hope we will see you at our future events too. This was our last in the series in this semester, the European Studies Seminar, but we will get back in the autumn. So we'll send you the invitation. Thank you so much. We wish you all the best and hopefully see you very soon again. Thank you, everybody. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you
Thank you
very
so
much.
much. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.